to introduce Lisa Tang, who is our first speaker. Lisa is a PhD student and has worked with the Guelph Family Health Study for a number of years, and she's going to present on screen time. And her favorite snack is
yogurt. I mean, like, yogurt's pretty good, to be honest.
So Lisa, whenever you're ready, feel free to present.
Thank you for the introduction. Yogurt is one of my many favorite snacks, so I appreciate you sharing that with the group. And I'm actually really quite excited to be here for the 7th birthday party presentation. The focus of my presentation will be, as you can tell from my slides, screen time. And so the way it's going to work is I'm just going to start quickly with the recommendations. How much screen time should our kids be viewing? And then I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea about how much screen time Guelph Family Health Study kids are actually getting. And then I'm going to end with some tips and tricks based on our research that might help to reduce the screen time of viewing in your own home. So I want to start by just also saying, when Jess asked me if I could present about screen time in the Guelph Family Health Study kids, the first thing that popped into my head was this quote from a Guelph Family Health Study parent that had me laughing for days. And that's probably because I felt the exact same way when my kids were a little younger about this exact same TV show. So in honor of that parent and all parents who have grown tired of a specific children's television show, I have named this presentation, Please, Anything But the Wiggles, Screen Time Among the Guelph Family Health Study Kids. So before I get into how much screen time our Guelph Family Health Study kids are actually watching, I think it's helpful to have those numbers in context. So the Canadian Sedentary Behavior Guidelines put out these recommendations for young children, and they split it up with different age groups. So for children less than 2 years of age, the recommendation is actually no hours, so no screen time per day. And then for children 2 to 4 years of age, less than an hour of screen time per day is recommended. And 5 years and older, up to 2 hours of screen time per day. Now, I do want to note that this is referring to excess screen time. So screen time above and beyond any schooling. Now, the Canadian Pediatric Society noted in a report that about 15% of children are actually meeting those screen time recommendations. So we do have a little ways to go in Canada. So why is too much screen time a concern? Well, I'll start by saying, although some use of screens have been shown to support education in older children, in younger children, exceeding screen time recommendations can actually lead to some negative health and developmental outcomes. So for example, we know that sedentary behavior habits form early and persist over time. We know that there's a strong link between screen time and childhood obesity. And again, I'll say this is excess screen time. It can negatively impact attention span and cognitive development, as well as language delays. And they think this is because there is kind of a one-way conversation happening here. The screen is talking to the child, but other than the occasional Dora response, perhaps, the child isn't getting a whole lot of back and forth. So they're not actually practicing that language as much as they would off of the screen. And that can impact their language development. Now, how much screen time are Guelph Family Health Study kids actually getting? Well, in children under 2 years of age, children are getting around 56 minutes a day of screen time. In children 2 to 4 years, a little under an hour and a half per day is the average among Guelph Family Health Study participants. And for 5 years and up, children are getting about an hour and 45 minutes a day. So in general, it looks like Guelph Family Health Study kids older than 5 years are meeting those recommendations. However, kids aged 4 and younger are over the recommended amount of screen time from the surveys that were completed. Now, parents, we didn't forget about you. In case you were curious, parents on average are getting about 2 hours and 15 minutes of screen time per day. So it comes to the next question, which is the biggie. How can we help manage young children's screen time? Parents really are often the gatekeepers of their young children's screen time. And so through Guelph Family Health Study data and your surveys, so thank you for filling those out, we were actually able to come up with some evidence-based tips to help manage your children's screen time in the home. So I'll start with the first one. Tip number 1, avoid using screens to control a child's behavior. Kids love screens. Definitely my own love screens. And so this makes it really tempting to take away screen time as a punishment for bad behavior or promise a little extra tablet or television time as a reward for a job well done. So I myself have definitely done this in my home, not with the Wiggles, with other television shows I can stand a little bit more. But I will say that our study did show that using screen time as a means of controlling a child's behavior can actually result in a kid wanting to spend a little bit more time on the screen, making them desire it a bit more. And it's, if we think about food as a reward, it's kind of similar to that. So just like chocolate and cookies, it can cause them to want it a bit more. And so in the end, over the long term, children tend to watch a bit more screen time when we use it to manage that kind of behavior. The next tip is setting limits around screen use and then keeping track of those limits that you set. It is challenging to set limits around children's screen time, especially if you're implementing these new rules for the first time and perhaps the kids weren't actually expecting you to implement them. So our study does show that it's worth the effort. So setting limits around screen time was actually linked to children spending a little bit less time on the screens. And so likewise, keeping track of how much screen time kids were getting was also linked to children spending less time in front of the screen. So the tip is really, if you're going to the effort of creating and implementing these new screen time rules, which take a lot of effort and energy, it is helpful to then take the extra step to monitor how much screen time they're actually getting, because this does show that it helps to reduce their overall screen time. Tip number 3 is don't mix media and meals. Mealtime in my home is one of the main ways we learn about each other's day and share stories. Even during COVID and periods of virtual learning, this has been helpful because I get to hear my children's interpretation of the day. Now, some days, full disclosure, that interpretation is more accurate than others, absolutely. But if nothing else, it's definitely entertaining. So in our Guelph Family Health Study, children whose parents had television on during meals or allowed screen-based devices at the table actually had a higher screen time than the children whose meals were screen-free. So if possible, not really allowing screens at the table, but that also goes for us as parents as well, which kind of brings me to tip number 4, which is ditch the devices when you're engaging with your kids. We've all heard the phrase monkey see, monkey do. Well, our study showed that this was also true with screen time. I mentioned earlier to the group that I would actually like to change the saying to monkey view, monkey do, but it hasn't caught on yet. I don't feel like I'm getting a lot of support for that, but I think we can have it catch on in our community. So parents' use of screen-based devices when they're with their children was linked to children having a bit more screen time in their day. So when you are with your children, it is helpful. I know it's tempting and very easy, but it is helpful to avoid, when possible, looking at your phone. I do this myself. I catch myself doing it, but it's about being conscious of it and trying our best as well. So avoid using screens while engaging with your kids. I want to also note is kind of a great way to model healthy behavior, but then prioritize face-to-face interaction. So every time I do this, I think to myself, if I prioritize face-to-face interactions, maybe when they're teenagers, they'll prioritize face-to-face interactions with me. But I'm not sure if that's going to happen. So I will let you know on the Guelph Family Health Study 17th birthday party. So that is it for my tips. Thank you. And I look forward to your questions at the end. So I'll stop sharing now, Jess.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa. That was fabulous. Next, we have Becky, who is a PhD student working on physical activity with us, as well as Jake, who's an undergrad. And Becky's favorite snack is?
Cheese and crackers, and Jake's is similar to that, but hummus and crackers.
So when you're ready, you two.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. Similar to Lisa, I'm going to start off by talking about how much the Guelph Family Health Study children should be moving. So these are the current guidelines from the Canadian Society for Exercise and Physiology. And there are other guidelines about what a full 24 hours should look like for your child, but I'm mostly going to focus on the physical activity guidelines today. So for children who are toddlers between the ages of 1 to 2 years old, the recommendations are for 3 hours of any type of physical activity per day, including some energetic play. Now, when I say energetic play, I mean higher intensity activity, things like running and jumping, basically anything that will get your child out of breath. For children ages 3 to 4 years old, the recommendation is 3 hours of physical activity per day with at least 1 hour of energetic or that higher intensity physical activity. And then for children aged 5 to 17 years old, the recommendation is 1 hour of moderate to vigorous activity per day, at least 3 times a week, and several hours of light physical activity per day. So in the Guelph Family Health Study, we measure physical activity using devices called accelerometers, which you can see in the bottom left-hand corner. And hopefully this sheet looks familiar to you. We do ask you parents to fill out these sheets to let us know when children are sleeping, when they are napping, and when the device is removed. This gives us a ton of information about the different types of activity that the children are spending their time in during the day. And although I cannot imagine how hard it must be to get children to wear these devices, some of your comments did leave us with a pretty good idea. So from the pool parties and swimming lessons to the diaper explosions and temper tantrums, and the removal times caused by daycare staff, babysitters, or in-laws, we wanted to thank you so much for providing this information. It was invaluable for our data processing, and it also served as pretty good entertainment for the last few months. So from the entire movement analysis group, thank you so much. So this is some data from our baseline analysis, so all pre-COVID times. And I'm going to present some data on 3 different types of movement behaviors. So the first is sedentary behavior, which includes activities such as sitting, lying down, or maybe watching a movie. The second is light physical activity, which includes activities like walking or playing with toys. And the last is moderate to vigorous physical activity, which is that high intensity energetic play I mentioned earlier. So again, anything that basically leaves your child out of breath. So for the toddlers in the study, aged 1 to 2 years old, they spent about 72% of their time in sedentary behavior, which is about 8 hours. And this is all time where the monitor was worn and the child was awake. They spent an average of 16% of their day or 1.8 hours in light physical activity and 12% of their day or about 1.4 hours in moderate to vigorous physical activity, so that high intensity activity. For the preschoolers in the study, so children aged 3 to 5, about 61% of their day, or just under 7 hours, was spent in sedentary behavior. 24% or 2.6 hours was spent in light physical activity, and 15% of their day, or 1.6 hours of their day, was spent in moderate to vigorous physical activity. So now the question was, are children in the Guelph Family Health Study meeting the current guidelines? So again, the toddlers in the study were recommended to get at least 3 hours of physical activity of any type per day, and about 63% of the children in the study met those guidelines. For the preschoolers in the study, about 95% of them are meeting the current guidelines of 3 hours of physical activity per day with at least 1 hour of energetic play. So how does this compare to other children in Canada? So research shows that about 99% of toddlers are meeting the current guidelines. This decreases slightly in preschoolers. So 3 to 4 year olds, for 3 to 4 year olds, about 62% of them are meeting the guidelines. And then unfortunately, as children get older, only about 36% of youth between the ages of 5 and 17 are meeting the current guidelines. So this shows why it's important to establish really good physical activity habits while the children are young, so that they continue to be as active as they grow older. And to provide some tips on how to do that, I'm going to turn things over to Jake.
Thanks, Becky. Hello, everyone. My name is Jake, as Becky mentioned, and my role with the Guelph Family Health Study involves knowledge translation surrounding movement behaviors. Naturally, this means that I frequently work with the Canadian 24-hour movement guidelines. But when I started trying to find the information, I realized that the guidelines were not presented in the clearest way. As you can see here, this page is full of text that is very small, which makes it challenging to read. Additionally, it contains some scientific jargon that was not explained in much depth. And a perfect example of this is energetic play, which Becky talked about earlier. And finally, the additional information to help make this resource more clear is challenging to find. This led me to the idea of making a resource that presented these guidelines in a more clear and understandable way. Specifically, I tried to provide clarity surrounding any topics that may be confusing, such as different intensities of physical activity, provided links and QR codes where possible to additional information, and made it easier to read. My last goal was to present the information in a kid-friendly way so that parents could use this resource with their children. Beyond presenting the guidelines, I also want to help families to continue to reach the recommended physical activity. With the help of feedback from the Parent Council, which thank you very much again for, I made some resources like the one you can see on your screen here. The purpose of this resource is to provide some ideas for indoor activities that are screen-free and will break up sedentary behavior. This is especially important right now, as the COVID-19 pandemic has presented a significant barrier for staying active. This was evident in the results of a Guelph Family Health Study survey, as physical activity had decreased in 52% of children during the pandemic. Given this challenge, I thought I would give some quick tips for reaching the physical activity guidelines despite the pandemic. The first is to make physical activity fun. It shouldn't feel like a chore for kids. The second is to do activities of different intensities. This is important as there are recommendations about different intensities, but also so that children have enough energy to do a variety of physical activity throughout the day. The next tip is to do physical activity as a family, which will be good for all family members. And lastly, make sure to switch up physical activities so that children remain engaged and also practice different movements for their motor development. And if you're looking for some ideas for different physical activities to do with your children, you can visit the resources tab on the Guelph Family Health Study website. This is where my movement guideline resource will be posted in the next week or so make sure you check back in then. I want to thank you very much for listening, and I'll pass it back over to Jess.
Yay, we're so lucky to have you two thinking about movement. And Jake, thank you so much for all your work to make it so much easier for families to interpret. Just today, I learned 2 things I didn't know. So thank you so much. Now we have Hannah, who is a master's student working with us, as well as Jake's going to, I think, appear again with some tips around sleep. So we already know Jake's favorite snack, but Hannah's favorite snack is?
Bananas and peanut butter.
Great. So when you're ready, Hannah.
All right. So similar to Becky and Jake, I'm also a member of the movement behavior analyses group that's within the Guelph Family Health Study. So collectively, sleep, physical activity, and sedentary behavior are often referred to as the movement behaviors. And I really like this image here because it shows the collective nature of these behaviors and how they can occur fluidly throughout the day. With physical activity, you can see is further broken down into its different intensities. And then on the outer ring of this figure, we can see the different postures that these behaviors have been defined to occur in. So for example, sleep may take place in a seated, reclined, or lying posture. And Becky previously outlined the physical activity and sedentary behavior of the kids in the study. And now we'll move our focus to the other movement behavior, which is sleep, which obviously encompasses a large portion of our day and is vital to our overall health. We've seen that sleep is beneficial to us emotionally, cognitively, and physically, as it improves concentration, attention, memory, and increases our energy levels throughout the day. So organizations such as the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology and the World Health Organization have developed guidelines for sleep for specific age groups. And so the children in the Guelph Family Health Study fall into 3 of these different age groups. Toddlers, so that's children aged 1 to 2 years, it's recommended that they obtain a minimum of 11 to 14 hours of sleep per day. And this would include both naps and nighttime sleep. For preschoolers, so that's children aged 3 to 4 years, it's recommended that they acquire 10 to 13 hours of sleep. And this may include naps depending on the child's schedule, and then obviously includes nighttime sleep. And then lastly, youth, so that's children aged 5 to 13 years, it's recommended that they acquire 9 to 11 hours of nighttime sleep. And so similar to physical activity and sedentary behavior, we measure the children in the Guelph Family Health Study sleep using the accelerometers and the activity log sheets. And now I'll just go into some of the data we have for the children who are aged 3 to 5 years in the study. And I'll outline the amount that they're sleeping and then also the percentage of them who are meeting our guidelines. So on average, we see that the 3 to 4-year-old children in the Guelph Family Health Study are sleeping 10.65 hours of sleep per night, which is great. That means that it falls within that 10 to 13 hour guideline. And then when we look at the percentage of our kids who fall into this 3 to 4-year-old age group, we see that 47% of them are meeting the guideline and 53% of them are not. And it's also possible that we're missing part of their sleep as we're only capturing some of that nighttime sleeping behaviors. So we're not capturing some of their daytime napping. And then when we look at this by sex, we see that it's very comparable between the males and females, with the males sleeping on average 10.65 hours of sleep per night and the females sleeping 10.67. And then when we look at the percentage of the kids who are meeting these guidelines, we see that 44% of the males and 50% of the females are meeting these guidelines. And then for those who are not, it's 56% are not and 50% are not for the females. And then moving on to the slightly older kids, so that's the children who are aged 5 years in the study, and the guideline is now 9 to 11 hours. We see that on average, they're sleeping 10.96 hours of sleep per night, which again is great. That means that our average falls within that guideline. And we see that here, 87% of them are meeting their guideline, which again is great, and 13% are not. And then when we split this by sex, we see that males, again, on average are sleeping 11.36 hours and the females are sleeping 10.55 hours, which again is very comparable between the two sexes. And we see here that 75% of males and 100% of the females are meeting this guideline. So again, that's great. And so I really outlined the timing characteristics of the children in this study's sleeping behaviors, but the CSEP guidelines go on to further specify the importance of developing sleep hygiene, and Jake will go more into that now.
Perfect. Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, so sleep hygiene is a term you may not be familiar with, so I'll just define it quick for you. It's habits and practices that are conducive to sleeping well on a regular basis. And one that immediately jumps to mind for most people is trying to avoid screens before bedtime, but there's more to sleep hygiene than just that. As you can see on the screen here, this is another page from my movement guideline resource, which will be available soon again. It is a checklist for a consistent bedtime routine that promotes positive sleep hygiene. This includes doing calming activities before bed, not eating too close to bedtime, ensuring that the room is cool and dark, which is the optimal sleeping environment, and keeping a consistent bedtime and wake time. This checklist can help you keep track and serve as a reminder for what constitutes a good bedtime routine. So now that we've talked about all the movement behaviors, I just wanted to quickly share an additional page from my resource, which is meant to help families track these important behaviors throughout the week. This sheet has a reminder for what the guideline is for each behavior. For example, this is the preschool movement guideline tracker, and therefore has 10 to 13 hours under the sleep column, as you can see there. So this is another way to involve children in building the habits for these important movement behaviors, and can also make them a fun challenge as well. And just another reminder that sleep resources are available at the Guelph Family Health Study website under the Family Resources tab. And another reminder that my movement guideline, which contains some of the resources that you saw today, like the sleep hygiene checklist, will be available soon under this tab. So thank you again for listening, and I'll pass back over to Jess.
Fab job, Jake.
Well, now I know all the things to do before I go to bed and make sure I have a good sleep.
She was jealous of your checklist. She was like, I want that. So I'll have to print
organization.
I'll have to print it off. All right. And next we have Sabrina. Sabrina is also a PhD student working with us. And her favorite snack is
Goldfish crackers.
a kid favorite. I found that surprising since you're such a good cook, Sabrina. Whenever you're ready, Sabrina.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. My name is Sabrina Douglas, as Jess mentioned, and I'm a PhD student with the Guelph Family Health Study. And today I'll be talking about co-parenting quality and food parenting practices in the Guelph Family Health Study. So co-parenting quality refers to the ways that parents do or do not coordinate with and support each other in their roles as parents. It's related to marital quality, but only refers to aspects of relationships that have to do with parenting. And in the Guelph Family Health Study, you all answered questions about co-parenting quality on those long surveys that we email you every year, for which we're really appreciative, because all of us here today have used aspects of those surveys in one way or another. So we're really grateful for the time that you put into those every year. So the survey measured 7 aspects of co-parenting, as you can see on the slide here. So it asked questions like, do you and your partner have the same goals for your child? Do you believe your partner is a good parent? And do you feel supported by your partner as a parent? And from all of these responses, we calculated an overall score for co-parenting quality. And from previous research, we know that more supportive and less undermining between co-parents is associated with better parental well-being and child behavior. So food parenting practices are actions taken by parents that can influence their children's eating. And we commonly hear or talk about practices such as having a rule that everyone has to finish all the food on their plate before they can leave the table, or using food to reward certain behaviors in kids. But parents actually use a lot more practices that they might not even realize, but that we've studied in research. And in the GFHS, we measured 3 kinds of practices: coercive control, structure, and autonomy support. Coercive control practices are parent-centered and include practices such as using food for emotional regulation, using food to reward behaviors, pressuring kids to eat, and restricting food for health reasons. These coercive control practices have been shown to be less effective at helping kids develop positive relationships with food and eating behaviors. So these structure practices refer to how parents organize the food environment for their family. And this includes practices such as providing a healthy home environment, modeling healthy eating, monitoring intakes of certain foods, and allowing children to control what they eat. And then lastly, the autonomy support practices refer to how parents promote independence for their kids by including them in meal prep or encouraging a balanced and varied diet, for example. And these structure and autonomy support practices have been shown to be more effective at helping kids develop healthier relationships with food and eating behaviors. So in the Guelph Family Health Study, we measured co-parenting quality and food parenting practices among heterosexual couples living together. And we found that mothers and fathers used similar food parenting practices, but fathers had slightly higher co-parenting quality compared to mothers. We also found that better co-parenting quality among moms and dads was associated with some food parenting practices. However, we found more associations with moms and with the structure practices. So what do these results mean? Well, since we found more associations among moms, it's possible that this could be because mothers are usually involved more in feeding when children are younger, therefore making the co-parenting relationship more relevant to their food parenting practices. And we also found more associations among the structure feeding practices. And an explanation for this could be that these practices require a more shared approach to feeding and a more organized environment. And since co-parenting refers to how parents support and agree with each other, better co-parenting might allow for this more shared approach to feeding. For example, creating a regular mealtime routine or ensuring a healthy home environment probably requires more collaboration and support between co-parents compared to some of the more individual focused practices, such as pressuring kids to eat. And so based on these results, we can conclude that all parents should be included in conversations around food parenting, and that co-parenting quality is an important consideration when we as researchers are thinking about ways we can support families around feeding. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions later on.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sabrina. That was fabulous. So our next speaker is Erin. Erin is an undergrad student who's been working with the Guelph Family Health Study well, since the pandemic started, for sure. I've seen Erin's face once in person, but we're thrilled to have you and excited to have you present. And Erin's favorite snack is?
Apples and peanut butter. Personal favorite.
So Erin, whenever you're ready.
Perfect. Thank you both so much for that lovely introduction. So as Jess mentioned, my name is Erin, and I'm a research assistant with the Guelph Family Health Study. I also conducted a 4th-year research project this past year. And through this project, I aim to answer the question, are children in the Guelph Family Health Study eating a healthy breakfast? To begin, breakfast is often referred to as the most important meal of the day, as this meal provides energy and nutrients that are needed for the day. Many previous studies have associated eating breakfast regularly with positive health outcomes such as improved body weight, as well as cognitive function. Previous studies have focused on the frequency of breakfast consumption and have found that only a small number of preschool-aged children skip breakfast regularly. The fact that almost all preschool-aged children eat breakfast justifies a focus on breakfast quality, which is what my project focused on. Focusing on breakfast quality can help to identify gaps and areas in which the breakfast meal can be improved. In order to assess breakfast quality, benchmarks for a healthy breakfast are needed. This will allow us to compare the calorie and nutrient intakes of the children in the GFHS at breakfast to the recommended benchmarks. The International Breakfast Research Initiative, or the IRBI, established these benchmarks for a healthy, balanced breakfast. These benchmarks represent a number of calories and amount of each nutrient that should be consumed at breakfast. And these benchmarks can be used to assess the breakfast quality of anyone aged 3 or older. All of the data for this project was collected through ASA 24, which likely sounds and looks pretty familiar to you, as you have all been amazing at completing your ASA 24 recalls. Thank you so much for doing this, as projects like mine would just not be possible without the time that you have put into completing yours and your child's ASA recalls. For this project, children in the Guelph Family Health Study aged 3 to 5 were included in the breakfast quality assessment. Only 3 out of 163 children did not report consuming breakfast on the day of recall. The breakfast quality of the remaining 160 children was assessed by tallying the number of children who met the IRBI recommendations for energy, or the amount of calories consumed at breakfast, and many nutrients. So now I will be presenting how many children in the GFHS met or did not meet the recommendations for a healthy, balanced breakfast for each nutrient. The green on each graph represents the number of children who did meet the recommendations, and the red represents the number of children that did not. So first, looking at energy, we can see that 83% of children met the recommendation, which demonstrates that children in the Guelph Family Health Study were eating enough food at breakfast on the day of recall. As you can see from the graph that represents added sugar, most children in the Guelph Family Health Study are eating a relatively low amount of added sugar at breakfast and do meet the recommendations. In terms of other nutrients, for example, protein, carbohydrates, fat, and dietary fiber, the majority of each graph is red, which shows that most children in the Guelph Family Health Study are not meeting the recommendations for these nutrients on the day of recall at breakfast. These nutrients represent areas of improvement for the breakfast meal. As you can see from this next slide, only a small number of children are meeting the recommendations for vitamin D, calcium, vitamin C, iron, and potassium at breakfast on the day of recall. The majority of children are not consuming enough of these nutrients at breakfast and do not meet the recommendations. So, although the amount of red on these graphs may seem a bit alarming at first, it's important to consider that they only represent the amount of each nutrient consumed at breakfast and not for the entire day. So for example, only a small number of children met the recommendations for vitamin C at breakfast. However, it's very possible that children in the Guelph Family Health Study are consuming foods rich in vitamin C throughout the rest of the day and overall do meet the recommendations for the day, just not at breakfast. In addition, since we only assessed one breakfast meal for each child, the day of recall may not have been a typical day for their breakfast. So overall, we can see that the vast majority of children in the Guelph Family Health Study are consuming breakfast and consuming enough calories at breakfast. However, the nutritional quality of breakfast is sometimes poor and lacking in key nutrients such as calcium, vitamin D, and fiber. These results can be helpful for nutrition education and intervention programs that aim to improve the overall nutritional quality of breakfast. So now you're probably wondering, how can I ensure that my child is eating a healthy, nutritionally balanced breakfast? First, it is important to offer a variety of foods that align with Canada's food guide, including whole grains, protein foods, and fruit. Eating fruit at breakfast can improve fiber intake and boost intake of nutrients such as vitamin C and potassium. Dairy and fortified plant-based dairy alternatives are good sources of calcium, and eating eggs at breakfast can improve vitamin D intake as well as protein intake. Finally, consumption of whole grain breads and low sugar cereals can increase overall nutrient and fiber intake. Overall, breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and there are many ways to ensure that your child is starting their day with a healthy breakfast. Thank you for listening.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Erin.
I'll make sure Tara ate a great breakfast. Lots of
Good, Eleanor.
You've been one convert for sure. So thanks so much, Erin. That's a fabulous job. And Erin, it makes me think, as your presentation made me think of For those of you that have not found your way to our Healthy Habits, Happy Homes podcast, Sabrina and Lisa are our co-hosts, and they just wrapped up season 3. And the last episode of season 3 has different members of our team talking a bit about who they are and introducing themselves. And one of the questions many of them asked was their favorite breakfast food. So if you're curious what Guelph Family Health Study people eat for breakfast, Healthy Habits, Happy Homes podcast on our website, season 3, the last episode, you can find that out. All right, moving on to more nutrition information. We have Flora. Flora is also an undergrad student who's been with us over this past year. We're so thrilled to have her. And her favorite snack is?
Cashews, lightly salted. So we add the lightly salted.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Eleanor. That's very important. They have to be lightly salted. As Jess and Eleanor mentioned, my name is Flora. I am a research assistant with the Guelph Family Health Study. My research focuses on calcium and vitamin D intake. So let's start with some background information on calcium and vitamin D to warm us up for the rest of the presentation. Calcium and vitamin D are 2 very important nutrients that are commonly found in dairy products. Both nutrients are known to be crucial players in the healthy development and growth of young children, especially with respect to their bones. Calcium and vitamin D are also recognized to play really important roles in the prevention of lots of chronic diseases, such as cardiometabolic diseases and different types of cancers. But wait, so despite recognizing that calcium and vitamin D are so important for child health and growth, lots of children in Canada actually aren't meeting the national dietary recommendations, more specifically known as the Dietary Reference Intakes, or DRIs. To really illustrate this, the Canadian Community Health Survey carried out a study and found that 23% of children 4 to 8 had inadequate calcium, and 93% of children 4 to 8 did not get enough vitamin D in their diet. So recent studies of dairy consumption trends, one by Statistics Canada in 2015, showed that per capita cow's milk consumption has been declining in the last 55 years, with the largest decline observed between 2009 to 2015, so more recently. For example, whole milk has decreased by 80% between 1960 to 2015. Interestingly, cheese and yogurt consumption has increased, as well as plant-based beverage consumption or other dairy alternative consumption. The objective of my research was to identify the dietary sources of calcium and vitamin D in children in the Guelph Family Health Study. How did we do this? We assessed your children's 24-hour dietary recalls. As previously mentioned by Erin, our research wouldn't be possible without your completion of your child's dietary record. So thank you for that. And this is just a little screenshot. You may remember this when you were filling out the dietary recall. Okay, so what were the results? Let's start with calcium. For calcium, the top source was cow's milk, which includes all types of cow's milk, so whole, reduced fat, flavored cow's milk. And this contributed 38% of the children's calcium intake. As the second top source, we had cheese, all types of cheeses. And the third top source was plant-based beverages or fortified plant-based beverages, contributing 21% of the children's calcium intake. So how about vitamin D? Similar to calcium, the top source of vitamin D was cow's milk. So all types of cow's milk, once again. This time it contributed 63% of children's vitamin D intake. This was followed by plant-based beverages as the second top source. And then tied for third, we had eggs and fish. So some things to consider. The children's average calcium intake was 843 milligrams per day. The recommended levels are 800 milligrams for those under 4 and 1,000 milligrams for those over 4. So it seems we're generally doing okay here for calcium. The children's average vitamin D intake was 4.1 micrograms per day. Now the recommended levels are 15 micrograms per day. This may be a little more concerning here, or seems a little low compared to the recommended levels. And in our research, there was some suggestion that the older kids had a lower vitamin D intake than younger kids, but there does need to be more research to confirm this. So some key take-home messages. Cow's milk, we saw, was the greatest dietary source of calcium and vitamin D. This points at the important role that milk plays in increasing calcium and vitamin D intake. Non-dairy foods, especially fortified plant-based beverages, were also top sources of both key nutrients. So maybe consuming more cow's milk and fortified plant-based beverages together can help make sure your kids get enough calcium and vitamin D. That's everything from me. I look forward to hearing any questions after all the presentations.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Flora. That's fabulous. Our final presentation is by Valerie, and Valerie is a PhD student working with our study. And Valerie's favorite snack, one of mine,
is something you might want to, something you take when you are watching a movie or anything like that. Popcorn. Yay.
Popcorn. Whenever you're ready, Valerie.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me just get my slides going here. Awesome. I'm going to jump right in. But before we get too deep into the research, I think it's helpful to take a step back and think about what stress actually is. So some of us might know it as the fight or flight response, and this is because we evolved stress as a survival mechanism. So not many of us have to run away from lions anymore, but if we did, this complex network of neurological and biochemical factors would give us the mental and physical energy to do that. The one downside is that our poor bodies can't tell the difference between which dangers are real and which ones we just think might be coming. We set up the same chain reactions for both types of danger. It's also totally normal to feel stressed sometimes. The good news is that our bodies are strong enough to handle the occasional really bad day. During those bad days, there's a bunch of different ways that stress can make us feel. Emotionally, we might feel upset, angry, or sad. We might crave sweet or fatty foods and comfort eat. My personal go-to is pistachio ice cream. Our bodies think we need this extra energy to recover from fighting that lion. Stress can also disrupt our sleep, either making us sleep less or not as deeply. And stress also makes us want to conserve our energy, so it can be hard to motivate ourselves to be physically active. Normally, our bodies are resilient and we can power through this in the short term. But if we have lots of bad days, or maybe even bad weeks or bad months, all of these small changes build up over time and we start to see some long-term consequences. So now let's take a closer look at some of the GFHS research. In this first study, we used the wonderful responses to our stress questions that you all completed on the online surveys and combined that with the body fat data that we collect during our health assessments. As an aside, thank you everyone for being so awesome at doing these assessments at home. It's such important data for us and we really appreciate it. These results found that parents who had more stress also tended to have more body fat. This could be because of changes to our sleep, diet, and activity patterns when we're stressed, like we talked about earlier. We dug a little deeper into the stress and diet data and found that highly stressed parents tended to eat more of the foods that promote inflammation, things like carbs, cholesterol, and saturated fats, and less of the anti-inflammatory foods, high in fiber, omega-3 fatty acids, and other helpful vitamins and micronutrients. But we didn't see any associations among kids. We also looked at how stress might influence which habits parents use for managing children's screen time. We found that stressed parents were more likely to use parenting practices that Lisa's research found was linked with greater children's screen time overall. So for example, using screens in front of kids during meal times, less limit setting, and less monitoring screen use. We also did a study about a year ago to check in with families during the earlier stages of COVID to see how everyone was coping. Not surprisingly, lots of families were having a tough time during the pandemic, so if you find yourself more stressed than normal, you aren't alone. Families pointed out reasons like managing childcare and homeschooling, as well as financial instability. We also took a look at how the GFHS program was affecting family stress levels. The GFHS wasn't designed to target family stress specifically, but we were concerned that maybe when we were trying to help families change their health behaviors, we might have been inadvertently shaking things up and increasing family stress. But thankfully, the results even a year after the intervention showed no change in stress levels. But this may mean that other health studies might need to include specific stress-reducing strategies if we want to have a positive impact, not just no negative impact. Now let's talk about some resources we can all use to help manage family stress. If you visit the GFHS website, you can find a collection of resources on stress, including some specific resources to help with pandemic-related parenting challenges. One of the resources we developed was a tip sheet on how to recharge your mental batteries. It's important to prioritize your own self-care. Just like they tell you on an airplane, you have to put your own oxygen mask on first before you can help others. Small actions like going for a walk, getting enough sleep, and choosing healthful snacks can add up to a big impact on your well-being. Regular routines help reduce stress for the whole family because it keeps everyone on the same page and reduces uncertainty. Get kids involved in making family routines that include time for learning, playing, and relaxing. Try unplugging for a little bit. Too much information just overwhelms our brains. So try to limit your media exposure and consider turning off non-essential notifications, even if only for a few hours. It's important to maintain connections with the people who help you feel supported, listened to, and loved. So try virtual playdates or phone call coffee hours, whatever works for you. Any little bit of activity is good for stressed bodies. Check out our website for the tips Jake put together for some new activities to get the whole family moving, and find the little moments of fun where you can. If you need extra support, there are lots of mental health professionals that would be happy to help. Please get in touch if you need them. These organizations exist to be used, and they're open to everyone because we all deserve to feel our best mentally and physically. All of these resources are listed on our website stress section if you'd like to check them out later. And now I will pass things back over to our lovely party hosts, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have during our Q&A session. And thank you all so much for participating. We couldn't have done these studies without our awesome family.
Thank you so much, Valerie. That was fabulous. I'm impressed with how much you were able to share. That was a lot of studies that you have led and done, which is really impressive. And thank you for that summary of recharging.
Well, on that hand, I feel very recharged after that. Like all the ways.
Thank you so much to all of our fabulous presenters. As Malcolm mentioned, they are the engines that run our study, and you can see why. That was really impressive. And I'm going to pass it off to David. He'll monitor questions and next steps.
Thanks, Jess. So I wanted to take this opportunity to also thank the students for their wonderful presentations. It's just a little window into all the wonderful things that the study has done this past year and over the last 7 years, building up to this point in time as well. And that also means a big thanks to all our families for contributing to the research activities and the knowledge that we have been able to acquire and pass along throughout, and especially tonight through the student presentations. It's my pleasure to moderate the question period now. I see there's a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is about the screen time guidelines. So going back to the guidelines around screen time, do screen time activities such as cosmic yoga or other screen-based activities still count the same towards daily screen time? So maybe I'll ask Lisa and Jake to comment further.
Sure. So thanks for that question. It's a really good question, really good question. And I want to point out that these guidelines, as most people on this meeting probably guessed, were created before the time of COVID. And so when we think about these and excess screen time, we really were talking about, I think the spirit of the guidelines was really like television watching and video game playing. The more time we can get away from screens is really kind of what we should be aiming for. As I'm kind of talking to you now, my kids right now are on a virtual karate class where they're looking at the screen and following along with their karate teacher because they can't actually go into class. So I think about that. Does that actually count as screen time? They are being active, but I will point out that lack of activity isn't the only concern with screen time. There is some newer concerns that have been coming out around eye health as well. Actually, I can send in the chat a really great Conversation Canada article that was really well written about kind of steps we can do to help with that kind of thing. So to answer your question, does cosmic yoga and activities count if they're doing it in front of the screen, perhaps in kindergarten class? I've been counting that personally as part of education, but as far as the research goes, I'm the honest answer is I'm not actually sure, because it is part of school, but it's in excess of actually using it for learning. And I think that would be something that could be researched in the future. But if Jess or David or anybody else has any guidance or have read anything recently about that, I would be I can turn it over to you.
Well, I was just curious if Jake or Becky or Hannah had any further comments about activity and screen time.
My only comment would be that any activity that anyone's getting these days is good enough for me, no matter how you get it.
I agree. And it's Lori. So I'm one of the faculty members, part of the Guelph Family Health Study. And I think I agree that any activity is good. My daughter's upstairs doing a ballet class right now. So that's what we got. It connects her with her social circle. So that's great. But if you are looking for different activities to sort of engage with your child, and family-based activities is what we're trying to promote and encourage. I do recommend that you check out some of those physical activity resources that Jake has pulled together with input from Becky and Hannah. There's some really great ideas that hopefully will keep everybody moving and try and encourage time together. So if you're looking for non-screen based activities, hopefully that just gives you some inspiration. And if you find it useful, please let us know. Or if you've got ideas for future, please contact us. We'd love to hear from you.
So I'll just make one further last comment about screen time, and it's still a very new area of research and activity and our learning about how it's now so integrated into our everyday lives. So the last few years has really seen an explosion in terms of use of screens and other devices. So I think this is a brand new area, and each and every day, as researchers, we're learning more. So stay tuned. So while we're trying to categorize these things into very discrete buckets, I think we're learning very much that it's not a black and white issue. All right, there's another question in the chat, and it's for you, Valerie. Hi, Valerie. How can I grieve and parent in a healthful way? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so first off, I'm so sorry that you're going through that. It's a hard enough thing to go through grief on its own. It's as I've learned myself, it's entirely different to have to grieve during a pandemic. It just makes a hard thing all the more difficult. I think to give yourself a lot of permission to experience it as a hard thing, because it's difficult. To add parenting challenges on top of that, it's totally okay to be struggling with this. If you do need to reach out to a mental health expert, please do so. Those services exist to be used. In terms of trying to manage it with parenting, and to your question, in a healthful way, I think really going back to the basics of making sure that you're moving your bodies a little bit, getting enough sleep, and choosing foods that make you feel good and are good for you. I think if you can kind of master those fundamentals, even on more days of the week than not. And one other resource that I'll point you towards, there's a wonderful researcher out of the university, I think Lakehead University, and she does fantastic research on death and kind of the grief process. Along with that, her name is Dr. Kathy Cortez Miller, and we were lucky enough to have her as a podcast guest this past season. And so we have a podcast episode that talks about having those difficult conversations about death with your kids and some other advice in there. So I would point you towards that, and I wish you the best of luck.
Oh, thanks for that response, Valerie. We're going to ask each of the presenters to provide their top tip. We've heard a lot of tips and tricks and data and research on various topics. So I just wanted to take this little period of time for you to reiterate or share your thoughts on what is the most helpful tip that you've learned in your own activities and research. So we'll start with Lisa.
I guess my top tip, if I'm being totally honest, is going to be different than the four I suggested, because it's going to be kind to yourself. I think as parents, we often put a lot of pressure on ourselves to kind of do things as perfectly as we can, and it's just not going to be that. So, if I need 20 minutes, I'm not going to give my kids a pack of crayons, right? If I need 20 minutes, I'm sticking them in front of the screen, because that makes me a better parent. So I think I don't do it all the time, but I think about And I think about when I do it, and I use it deliberately. So I guess my top tip would be to be kind to yourself, because we are all truly just doing the best that we can.
Wonderful. Thanks, Lisa. Over to you, Becky and Jake.
Just for recommendations and guidelines, I know that the daily guidelines can seem a little bit daunting sometimes. So I think sometimes thinking about them as more like a weekly thing. So if you have like a little more of a sedentary day, then the next day try to be more physically active, and rest days are important, stuff like that. So just thinking about it more as a weekly thing makes it a little bit more manageable. Yeah, and that goes along with Lisa's point of being kind to yourself. If you're not perfect today, be a little bit better tomorrow. It's just habit building, all of this stuff.
I guess my favorite tip from what Jake shared was make it fun. So I know that times are a little bit hard right now for everyone and stressful, and I don't want anyone to be stressed about trying to get a certain amount of activity in. Try and make things fun, whether it's dancing in the kitchen to music while you're making a good breakfast, or putting on some really loud music while you're working out, whatever makes you feel good during that time. That would be my tip to make things fun.
That's a great tip. We just need to have fun and smile and laugh and do things that we enjoy. Thanks for that. Over to you, Sabrina.
So I study co-parenting and feeding. So I think my big tip in that area would be to talk to your partner about feeding kids. A lot of people talked about what they're going to put on the table, but there's lots of other things you can talk about, like what the food environment is going to be in your house and what that's going to look like on a day-to-day basis. So that's my tip.
Great, thanks, Sabrina. Communicating is important, even though we're all, isolated in little bubbles. It's still important to have open lines of communication. Over to you, Erin. What's your tip?
Yeah, so I guess two main tips surrounding breakfast would be to try and eat breakfast on more days than you don't. It's super important to just eat something first thing in the morning to get your energy up and give you nutrients that you need for the day. And then in terms of like serving your children breakfast, just try and serve a variety of different foods for different food groups to try and ensure that they're getting enough nutrients from different types of foods.
Thanks. Yeah, variety is important, and just to try and change it up and just do the best we can when we can. Thanks, Sarah. And over to you, Flora.
My main tip, so I studied dietary calcium and vitamin D, so strictly with food sources. I'm going to branch out a little bit, and although I'm no expert on vitamin D and calcium beyond food, it's the summer now, or spring's coming, and I feel like this will tie things in nicely. My tip would be to get outside when you can and get some sun, because we all do know sun is your best friend when it comes to vitamin D. As for the winter, which is behind us now, thank goodness. As for the winter, diet aside, maybe considering a vitamin D supplement, because in the winter, we do know from some of the research I read, we are low in Canada in our long winter. So those would be my two tips.
Thanks, Flora. I totally agree. Winter's behind us and the spring and summer's in front of us, and we need to take advantage of the wonderful weather that's in front of us. Over to you, Valerie.
I think if I had a single takeaway tip, it's to focus on the basics, moving your bodies, sleeping well, eating foods that are good for us. They're called the basics, not because they're easy, but because they're important. And I think if we can all just try and get those covered and look after ourselves to the best that we can, give yourself permission about all the rest, then that's how we can help others.
I see a question from Charlotte. Does the Guelph Family Health Study measure if children are receiving vitamin D supplements?
So yes, we do ask that as part of our survey if any family members are taking supplements, but I'm not sure whether that information was included in any of the presentations that were shown today, or if we were strictly looking at what was eaten in the food.
Yeah, I can just chime in here. We excluded vitamin D supplement information overall, but I think that would be a great area to look into as future research.
Thanks, Angela. I'm just going to add further to a comment that I see from Alice. like these tips are golden: being kind, taking a longer view, having fun, communicating, eating breakfast, getting outside, remembering the basics, evergreen advice, and particularly useful just now. So just to add further, I just thinking across the 7 presentations today, it really spans a lot of different areas. So what it means to me is that family health is more than just about screen time, more than just about diet and physical activity and sleep. It's about everything in terms of our daily lives and how we go about all the things that we do. And that health is not a magic bullet in one given area. It's a little bit of everything. But I think one nugget that I just want to emphasize a little bit more is that we need to have fun and not be overly stressed about all these things and trying to be perfect and trying to achieve some goal out in the distance. But just to have an awareness, strive to incorporate healthy habits in our lives, in our daily lives, as best as we can and when we can, because life is very complicated now, even more complicated now, and we shouldn't take the longer view of things and a bit of a balanced view of things. So there's another question that just popped up. As someone who values nutrition and offering balanced meals to my family, I'm curious whether food neutrality is a concept supported by the Guelph Family Health Study. If so, looking for ideas, resources of how to regulate unhealthy food with children in a way that doesn't further heighten the desire for those foods.
I can speak to this if you want to.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Lisa, I completely, the reason I want to answer, I think, is because your question resonates with me in that when we think about, when I think about my goals for my kids and their relation to their diet, certainly I want them to have a healthy diet, but I would say over that, I really want them to have a healthy relationship with food, right? Where they enjoy food and all kinds of food, and including foods that aren't very healthy but taste delicious, and so a few of the ways. So what does that mean? It gets hard when you actually move it into practice, right? So I want them to eat healthfully and have a good relationship, but then what do I do to make sure I'm not always saying no to unhealthy foods or always saying yes, right? And in the current food environment we live in, a kid can eat some unhealthy foods, multiple times in the day. So a few things that the research suggests. So there's, when we think of restriction, there's sort of 2 kinds of restriction or regulating unhealthy food. There's what we call covert and overt. So overt restriction would be if you had a plate of cookies out and Eleanor takes one and then I tell her, no, don't have the second. Now that's, I'm sort of overtly restricting her. Whereas covert would be just placing one cookie out, right? And then she can only eat the one cookie. Or you can not bring it into the home, right? If there's a particular food that you'd rather your kids don't have access to, it doesn't come into the home. Therefore, it's sort of unknown to them that it's being restricted. So that's that seems to be better at making sure that you can help kids to have more healthful eating, but also hopefully while sustaining a healthy relationship with food, and where you're not always sort of restricting and regulating all, arguing or fighting about some of those healthy or unhealthy foods. Hopefully that answers your question.
The cookies were good. They were good.
And the pretend cookies were good.
Thanks, Jess, for the answer. There's another question that just popped up about whether or not we are collecting data from children with outlying medical complexities, autism, for example, autism CP. If not, is this something you think may expand into the future? In terms of data collection, we are, it's a continuing evolving dimension of our data collection process. So as we're aging with our families, we're also thinking ahead in terms of what are potentially new areas or new questions we should be asking. In terms of outlying medical, I believe we have some open-ended questions that relate to this, but not in a very specific way. And so this is something that we might consider in future sort of surveys, but not an area that we're specifically tackling right now.
Related to that, one of our co-investigators whose name is Emma Allen Vercoe. Thank you very much. Emma Allen Vercoe is a collaborator on this study, and she does excellent work focused on autism. So that's another person you can reach out to if looking for specific research on autism in children.
To our presenters, just curious, you've learned a lot, you've done a lot. What do you think are the next set of questions that we might be asking down the road for future trainees? I'll let Lisa answer that first.
Perhaps how COVID has impacted screen time, and was it impactful? What are the different ways we can use screen time in the future and manage screens now with this new reality? Because although my hope is that we kind of go back to in-person learning, if I were to guess, I imagine that screens will be more integrated going forward in the future. So I'd like to see, I think I would be very curious as to how screens impact health going forward in the new reality.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Becky.
I guess my questions for the future, mostly around physical activity, would involve why physical activity decreases when children get older. So I'm sure there's a lot of literature out there that I haven't read, but because I focus on the younger children, but from what I do read, it really does decline as children reach puberty, and especially for girls. So I'm wondering why this happens, and I'm sure there's some kind of social emotional interaction, or maybe something with different social interactions that females have versus males. So I really hope that we can get into that in the research in the future.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a really great direction to move into as our families also continue to age. We'll have an opportunity to potentially look into that. Jake.
I think mine kind of goes with Lisa's original question about would an activity that involves physical activity but also screen time, would that be considered bad screen time? I think just getting more clear definitions around that sort of stuff is really important. And I think that's an area that could be looked at by future researchers. I think that's really, really important. It's just challenging. Even I didn't answer because it's a really hard question to answer. Personally, I would say yes, that's a great activity. Go ahead. If you're moving while you're looking at the screen, then that's good for me. But I don't know if that's the right answer, so more clear messaging around screen time would be a good area of future research.
I'll just add to that. I think it is a really interesting question. I don't think exercise on screens is bad screen time. The question is, does it count as screen time? But I think any exercise is good exercise, whether that's on the screen or not, for sure. But I think it's a great question. And actually, David, I'm going to throw in a second one if I can. My PhD research really focuses on social media. So I would be really interested to see the social media use in our young children, and then looking long term to see whether there are differences in social media use when they're young and outcomes when they're older. So I'll throw that one in there since we were just curious anyway.
Awesome. Thanks, Lisa. Hannah.
It's funny, I think throughout this degree, I guess my undergrad and master's now, I've learned more about what I don't know as opposed to what I do know. So I think a lot of my research questions now are really focused on how we're actually measuring sleep and physical activity. So kind of going back to our measurement techniques and how we can actually optimize these and better inform, I guess, our recommendations for people. So I think that's really what I'm interested in right now.
Spoken like a true researcher. You're very keen about methodology and how precise we can measure things. That's great. Sabrina.
Yeah, I think that future research questions about co-parenting, I think that they should be focused around different representations of families, co-parenting in same-sex couples, non-white families, children with disabilities, or even intergenerational families. Much of the research right now on co-parenting is so focused on one picture of the family, and it's just not very representative of the real world. So, yeah.
Great point. There are family structures of all kinds out there, and so there's more to learn. Thanks, Erin.
I think that one area of research that could be looked at in the future in terms of breakfast research is different ways to measure breakfast quality. So my research focused on like nutrients rather than overall foods, whereas in the future, I think we could look at what foods are the kids in the GFHS actually eating for breakfast, and then like long-term, how does their breakfast quality when they're a young child kind of translate into their health as they get older as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Erin. And over to you, Flora.
Yeah, vitamin D is tricky. We're going to focus on vitamin D. There's been a lot of literature showing discrepancies in, serum or blood vitamin D levels and, what the kids seem to be getting in the diet, which seems to be really low. A lot of the time, the blood seems to be okay, depending on different standards or different reference values. So I'd be curious to, I don't know if that's within the scope of the Guelph Family Health Study, but I'd be curious to maybe do some comparison with, serum vitamin D. And one thing that I'm also really curious about, as mentioned in my presentation, there's some suggestion potentially that older kids, and there's literature to support this, older kids, seem to, as we get older, we consume less milk and less dairy. And I'm wondering, why exactly that is. So that's something else that we can further explore as well. This is a longitudinal study, right? So we can see if the younger kids, as they get older, actually consume less milk or have even lower vitamin D levels than what's already there.
Yeah, and that's a great point. We're a longitudinal study, we're a long-term study, and we can therefore look at changes over time. So that's a great thought there. And then lastly, Valerie.
I mean, I'm biased. I think the stress research is the coolest research, and so all things stress get my vote. But I think what the Guelph Family Health Study can do really well is, because we have these amazing families and because we have such an incredible team that powers the study, I think we can draw on everyone's different strengths to ask new questions that kind of no one's thought of before. Like Lisa and I collaborated on a project to look at stress and screen time, and I'm collaborating with Flora and a couple other students to look at stress and kids' sugar intake. I think that because we have such a powerhouse team of all these different experts, perhaps someone like Lori, our physical activity expert, could combine with someone like Dr. Emma Allen Burkle, who does gut research, and come up with this completely new concept of health that we haven't thought about before, or just all those different things that combine everyone's skill set. I think it's an exciting future ahead of us, and we have so much incredible data to dig into.
Thanks, Valerie. And I love that idea. We should look at the gut microbiome and physical activity, Lori. Well, I wanted to end by just answering, I see one last question from Malcolm about grandparents. So he asked whether or not we've considered including grandparents. And certainly we've had that discussion many times now. And that's, I think, a very important dimension that we are still considering. We are kind of indirectly collecting information about that, but I think there's an opportunity to do it in a more concerted manner. Just going back to the earlier point about the fact that there are families of all shapes and sizes. And so multi-generational families is certainly an important component to that. I wanted to close by thanking all the presenters again. I wanted to thank all of our families as well who have made it possible to have 7 years of really incredible experiences, training opportunities for our many trainees, over 120, I believe, to date, spanning undergraduates, masters, PhDs, and postdocs. And I see in the note here, here's to another 70 years, I think 7 years and more. And thank you again, everyone, for being on being part of our 7th anniversary birthday celebration. And it's been a blast tonight. Really learned lots myself in terms of what everyone's been up to. And I hope everyone on the call has also learned some helpful tips that you can incorporate into your own family activities.
Have a safe and wonderful summer, and thank you so much for coming. And thanks, Malcolm, for your words of welcome at the beginning. Yeah, yeah. And Eleanor would like to say something, of course.
I liked all of your presentations. Editing, great job. That's all.
That's right.